today I will present like the sort of outline of my PhD for now. And to start with, like what we also have discussed like over the week is that there are certain technologies that we've seen in over the past decades that might contribute to sustainable development. But for these technologies actually to have an impact, they need to diffuse. And what is said like in recent development approaches is that this diffusion of technology should go through market-based approaches. So in a way there should be a market for technology. So a market in the sense that there should be suppliers, like entrepreneurs supplying technologies, and on the other hand also like consumers willing and able to adopt these technologies. So a market. And it tends to be that these markets formed by upscaling local initiatives. And this is relevant because it seems that like, at the moment there has been spoken also like in academic literature, but also like in policy reports about this base of the pyramid, or like of 4 billion people nowadays with like specific needs for example, electricity, clean water, sanitation. And these new technologies, like for example, solar home system or clean cook stove technologies, have been argued to actually to address these needs. But at the same time, we also see that it's a potential market, but that the market not really exists yet. So there have been, like what you see in policy reports typically is that they say, well, there is a potential market, but the market is not yet functioning well, as in the technology is not really diffusing through these market-based approaches. Well, and then what we see, so the setting basically, so these unfulfilled needs and a potential market, and at the same time that these markets sort of formed by upscaling local small-scale initiatives. But what we see in reality actually is that many of these initiatives remain very, very small, like local, small-scale impact, and that this actual upscaling, what has been argued for, that is really problematic. And there have been like many enablers and barriers listed of upscaling. But like so it's like there are many elements of this problem, and at the same time also upscaling is a sort of very broad theme that a lot of scholars in different fields, but also like in policy, have been argued for. But what it is exactly, that's not so clear. So my PhD thesis is then what does it take to scale up, and what are the outcomes for upscaling? So the outcomes, the impacts for the market. And then I'll look at the specific case of the East African market for emerging technologies, and then the case of solar home systems. So as I just said, like there has been urged for upscaling, but there's a lack of systematic insights in what upscaling entails, and what the underlying mechanisms are. And I already had some debates also with scholars from the transition fields. This is not only something that is a problem like in policy reports, but also in transition studies, and at the same time there's the same argument made in business model literature. So, and then the second point is, so so what are the outcomes for upscaling? As there is like a lot of like hypothetical outcomes that have been put forward, but it's never really tested. And this is relevant because if policymakers actually urge for upscaling, then the question is of course like, okay, but then what will that mean for like the actual development? So I did a background basically. I won't go into all the details, but what I did in motivating this research is basically looking at the different development approaches, like from the 50s onwards, and also like the research fields that have specifically been interested in what's happening for market development and in low-income countries. And well, one of the very interesting things is actually that already in development studies around the 80s, there's already said that, okay, so we need upscaling, but the first step is that we need local initiatives, we use like participatory approaches which make sure that technology actually address needs of the actual populations, that we don't use it top down and say, well, okay, this is the appropriate technology, you will use it now, that it actually doesn't work, but that you really need to start on small scale. And this is also a debate that has come back like over the past days about like really making sure that the technology fits the needs. Well, but then what we see like in this sort of later, more recent contributions, as I just said, in business literature and transition studies, is that this upscaling is not well understood, and at the same time it is a very urgent matter. So more specifically for my future research, what I'm doing now is making a systematic analysis of what cases from business model literature and transition studies, but also in addition to like the development studies that already discussed this earlier, this problem of upscaling, what they say about the barriers and enablers of upscaling, just as a sort of first general outline what it means. But then also what you see if you do this is that upscaling is not just one concept, and well, obviously that's not new, there have been other papers on this, but there are specific types of upscaling that make a connection to the actual markets. For example, they speak of geographical upscaling, that means that their technologies become available in other locations. They speak of intensifying, so the technology, like more people in the same area diffuse the technology, or upscaling in the sense that more customer segments become served. So like, for example, like other sort of segments of the customer, of the base of the pyramid, for example, so people with lower incomes, or sometimes scaling up to customer segment with higher incomes. So this is like sort of first broad outline of what is actually then going on. And then the second part I'm working on is making this connection about what we see like in the literature, and also what we see in reality if we look at one specific case of how this market is forming for the solar home system in the East African region, and how individual actors with their initiatives scale up and contribute to this on meso level to how the market is forming. So yeah, that was the first outline of the project. I won't go into much details now about I didn't do that about the exact methodology because I was a bit hesitant, because I still need to collect the data, and I very much hope that will work out, but obviously that's still a bit of a challenge. So are there any questions? Okay, good.
If you can clarify, to me it's not very clear yet whether diffusion and scaling up is one and the same thing, whether scaling up is a specific aspect of diffusion. There's a lot of people who have looked at different typologies of diffusion, the old things, old adoption models, and then there's an interest in the actual process itself. There's recently, within the transitions literature, there's been this whole talk about, for instance, deepening, broadening, scaling up. So there are all sorts of discussions there. You mentioned, I think, very interesting that the preliminary subcategories that you find, you talked about geographical circulation, intensification, and other forms. I wondered whether these are, well, yeah, maybe you can tell me the difference between diffusion and scaling up. It almost seems
like the same thing. Yeah. Well, I've been wondering about the exact same thing, and the same actually with like the formation of a market, which also seems to go about like the diffusion of innovation. Well, from my perspective, it's basically looking at the same thing. So how more people, how like things get adopted like on larger scale. You can either call it diffusion, but then like in traditional diffusion literature, it's put in a slightly different way. But as the term is used nowadays, it seems to refer to some of the same phenomenon in my perspective. You might not agree, of course.
Well, I mean, if the main process you're looking at is an increased adoption,
yeah.
So the growth of the population of adopters.
Yeah,
I think that's
yeah, yeah.
really a diffusion process.
Yeah.
But then you can open this up and look at different paths to diffusion. One of them is through scale of making bigger things. One is through geographical circulation, etc. But I wouldn't put them all into a scaling. I think it's more useful potentially theoretically to start from diffusion and unpacking diffusion. Scale is one of them. Geographical circulation is another one. And there's
Yeah, I would fully agree with you, because I think like actually the term diffusion originally is about the spread of ideas. So it's really about spread, how it was originally defined. So in that sense, I would say it's similar to like these, like if you say upscaling is like reaching more people, and diffusion is also about reaching more people. And you could say it's sort of similar.
But that's the question.
that's the question, I suppose.
Yeah, I said like I think it's referring to the same phenomenon. But we can discuss it later, because I think it's a nice debate, and I definitely like your input, because it's a bit, yeah.
So I think part of the answer to that question would have to do with identifying the specific types of technologies that you're looking at, because you said you're looking at the East African market, right?
Mm-hmm.
But have you identified the cases in terms of actual technologies that you will be focusing on? Because that would determine the diffusion. And I'm saying that because yesterday we had a panel that someone was talking about mobile money, for example, which is a technology that has really taken up in Ghana, everywhere. Like it's just so simplified, and it's because people really wanted it, and also it was easy, and it went through a particular commodity that everybody had. Everyone has a cell phone, and it doesn't have to be a smartphone for you to have mobile money access. So I think identifying the cases or the specific types of technology would help you figure out how it could be diffused, and whether this dichotomy between upscaling and diffusion it's worth it.
Yeah. Yeah, I didn't go much into that, but my plan is to look specifically at technology, so solar home systems.
Okay.
Yeah, and so in that sense, it's different from the diffusion of mobile money, which is more sort of a service. Yeah. So I agree with you. Thanks. Yeah.
Well, I mean, you could also consider the solar home system as a service. I mean, that's how it's been implemented in South Africa. I would suggest that it's not necessarily been successful here.
Depends on how it's used. Anyway, yeah.
Semantics. So, I mean, along those lines, I immediately thought of mobile money, partly also because it originated in Kenya from a Kenyan, East Africa, from a local, and some of the language you're using sounded very much like to ensure diffusion, you have to ensure that there's participation, ensure that it's appropriate to local context, ensure that people feel ownership over it, which is language which sounds like an external person trying to work out how to make their product work. And I don't know enough about the solar environment in Kenya. I'd assume it would probably be quite good in rural spaces and decentralized infrastructure areas. And I don't know from preliminary inquiry if you could find different cases, one where perhaps there's an external source, or one which has emerged from a local entrepreneur or something, and maybe compare the success of it. And I immediately thought, instead of seeing a system that's not working, how can we make it work? Actually see which one is working, what lessons could we move from there, is a comment.
I like the comments, and I thought there's definitely overlap between these ideas, because I think that is the other most well-known example about a technology that has actually been widely used. So yeah, I've also been thinking about that. I think there's a slight difference, is that these technologies that I speak of, like for renewable energy, is actually something that has been put on from the international community wants this, like it's developed in this setting. Whereas I'm not so sure about that for mobile money. I think it was also part of a microfinance project, but I don't know exactly how it came about. Yeah, good comment. Thanks. Break. Sorry?
Any questions from the floor? No questions?
Okay.
If not, we can stop here and have
I have a further comment. Also who the key actors are. So I mean, Sudan mentioned also success in Nigeria, and in Lagos State particularly, the government has said, since we can't actually affect national policy, we're going to put solar panels on all civil buildings. And so schools and hospitals now have massive solar arrays, which has been really successful. That's also because the centralized infrastructure sucks. So it's been very successful, but as a top-down, as opposed to a market-driven thing, perhaps. So that could be a consideration of different modes of implementation.
Yeah, like the ones who are the actual actors. Yeah. So what you see mostly in the solar home system market for household use is that there are these international actors as well, like donor organizations who either being entrepreneur or like non-profit trying to establish a sort of market model, or public-private partnerships. These are mostly like the key actors in trying to establish this market. Yeah, but obviously there are many more. So.
Cool.